Welcome and thank you for joining the Williams Institute for a discussion about transgender people and the evolving public policy landscape. Introducing our moderator and the Reid Rasmussen Fellow and a senior scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute, Jody Herman.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our webinar today. I'm Jody Herman. I'm the Reid Rasmussen Senior Scholar of Public Policy at the Williams Institute. With me today, we have two very special guests, Andrew Flores, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at American University and a visiting scholar at the Williams Institute, and Vivian Topping, who's Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation. So in our webinar today, we're going to give a preview of new national and state level estimates for the United States, for the trans population in the United States. And though these estimates are preliminary, we're excited to share them with you so you can get a glimpse of what you'll see in our forthcoming report. And it's always good to remember when seeing these types of estimates that they represent real people who are living throughout the United States and in states that vary quite dramatically in their state level public policy environments. So we're going to discuss the evolving policy situation in the states, particularly for trans youth. So the Williams Institute first published an estimate of the size of the transgender population in 2011. And with new emerging data sources, we updated those estimates in 2016. So these new estimates are part of a series of studies that the Williams Institute has engaged in on this topic since Gary Gates developed those first estimates about a decade ago. So before we preview these estimates, I'm going to invite Andrew Flores, my esteemed colleague, to discuss why it's so important that we produce these estimates and how we go about doing it. Andrew?
Thank you, Jody. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Dr. Herman just noted, I am an assistant professor at American University, as well as a visiting scholar at the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. Most of my research involves public opinion and social attitudes about LGBTQ people, strategies that people may take to change minds, as well as doing some policy-related work involving LGBTQ populations. Recently, I've been publishing and researching acts of violence directed towards LGBT people and understanding the disparities that may exist. As Jody had so clearly described, why is it that we produce these population estimates? Most importantly, it's the U.S. Census Bureau, in terms of the census, does not collect sexual orientation and gender identity data across numerous data sets, including the census. Though this data environment is changing, and just recently, the Household Pulse Survey, which is designed to kind of understand the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, began including sexual orientation and gender identity measures. However, in absence of, say, these official statistics, we need to come up with the next best approach in order to provide estimates of the number of people who identify, in this case, as transgender in the United States. And why does that matter? Well, as my esteemed colleague, Dr. Gary Gates would note, in many policy discussions, if you can't be counted, you don't count. And so population estimates such as this become very important in terms of the direction of public policy, the direction of different resources, and identifying, say, potential disparities, and then therefore potential policy solutions to disparities. And so in the absence of data, we provide, or in the absence of official statistics, we provide the best estimates we can. In this current approach, we've decided to rely on the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is what we used in the previous report that was published in 2016. The BRFSS contains a module that measures sexual orientation and gender identity. However, states may choose to take up certain modules and others and not other modules. And thus, we have in our data 33 states and where sexual orientation and gender identity measures were directly measured. That does mean, though, that there were a handful of states where we lacked data from those locations. And so since not all states are participating, we have to come up with a solution, a potential way that we can maybe arrive at a national number, incorporating the data that we do have, and then to learn about the data, learn about populations that where we may not necessarily have direct interview data. And so next slide, please. So what we did is that we merged the births data from 2017 to 2020, which includes over 4,000 individuals who self-identify as transgender, to estimate the size of the transgender population. We merged this data with the American Community Survey population estimates in order to say, okay, here's the number of people in the United States, or here's the number of people, say, within a specific state. And here's our best estimate about the percent of individuals who would identify as transgender in that location. And then that will help us arrive at a population estimate. So among the states that did have a direct measure, so we had actual interviews, we rely on the direct results from the BARFIS. This way, if an individual researcher or scientist were to go analyze the data themselves, they should arrive at approximately the same numbers that we produce in this work. Among the states that did not have this module, so that small handful, we rely on model-based estimates from a process known as multi-level regression and post-stratification, basically combining and wielding the information that we do have to draw inferences about the states and locations that we don't have the direct estimates. And we did compare and, of course, do all of our dotting of I's and crossing of T's to make sure that the estimates that we are producing for those unobserved states are reliable and robust. And so we did this, of course, by making comparisons with what the model would have estimated the transgender population would have looked like in the states where we do have data, to compare those to the direct estimates that we get from the BARFIS, and they correlate rather highly. And so this is likely the best that we can do with the data that's available to us. And with that, I'm going to pass the discussion to Dr. Herman, who will present to you some of our initial cuts of these findings.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a laborious process, but it's worth it in the end. So, and without further ado, let's look at a preview of some of these new estimates. So based on the new model that Andrew described, we find that 0.52% of US adults identify as transgender, which is about 1,377,000 individuals across the United States. Next slide. Can I get the next slide, please? Thanks. So based on what we found in 2016, this seems slightly lower than our 2016 estimate of 0.58%. But as you can see here, these kind of whiskers on the end of the bars on the chart represent 95% confidence intervals. So this suggests that these two estimates aren't truly very different from each other. And so in my mind, I kind of think of these estimates as kind of holding fairly steady over time. Next slide. So here's a visual representation of our state level data. The states here are ranked by percentage of the adult population who identifies as transgender, with the lighter yellow colors being the highest and the darkest colors being the lowest percentages. So you may notice brightly colored North Carolina over there to the right, and you may notice very dark Missouri in the middle of the map. Missouri comes in last in our rankings. Next slide, please. So here are our top 5 states this time around. So North Carolina, as I mentioned, is first with 0.87% of adults identifying as transgender, or just over 71,000 adults in the state of North Carolina. And second is Delaware, and then we've got Arizona, Alaska, and Arkansas comes in 5th. So, and it may be relevant to mention for later in our webinar that in terms of sheer numbers, Texas is pretty high on the list at around 93,000 adults. And over there in Virginia, they have about 31,000 trans adults. So those figures may be relevant in our discussion about the policy situation a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So here we're looking again at 2016 versus 2021. So our top 5 this time look quite different from our prior rankings. You can see in 2016 that Hawaii topped the list, followed by California, New Mexico, Georgia, and Texas. So yeah, the top 5 now looks quite different. But I'll add to this that one constant in both years is that Washington, D.C. has outranked all of the states in percentage of adults who identify as trans. DC is substantially ahead, so we consider it a bit of an outlier. So in fairness to the other states, we just let DC shine on its own in our report tables and don't include them in the rankings. Next slide, please. So we'll also include in our report estimates based on gender, age, and race and ethnicity. Today we can share a little bit about gender and age. The Burfus first asked respondents if they consider themselves to be transgender, yes or no. And then if a respondent answers yes, they're asked a follow-up question to ask if they identify as a trans woman, trans men, or gender nonconforming. And that's worded a little bit differently in the actual questionnaire, but essentially that's what they're getting at. We can't be exactly sure, but it's possible that some non-binary trans folks would select the gender nonconforming option. But notably, it doesn't say non-binary, it says gender nonconforming. So on the right, we see the percentage of US adults who identify as trans women, trans men, and gender nonconforming. And on the left, we show the gender breakdown of all adults who identify as trans. So trans women comprise 38% of the trans population, trans men comprise 36%, and gender nonconforming individuals comprise 26% of all adults who identify as transgender. Next slide, please. So here's the breakdown regarding age for adults. So on the right, we see that 18 to 24-year-olds appear to have the largest percentage of individuals who identify as transgender and comprise 30% of the trans population. So while the differences in the chart on the right might not be strictly statistically significant, that this estimate for the youngest age group there is part of a larger pattern that we're seeing, where we see younger age groups identifying as transgender at higher percentages than older age groups. Next slide. So in regard to youth estimates, so in 2016, we estimated that about 150,000 13 to 17-year-olds would identify as transgender. We don't have our youth estimates ready to preview today, but based on where we see our 18 to 24-year-olds, where they're at this time around, I think it's probably safe to assume that this percentage will be going up. And that's all I have to preview for you today, but I wanted to bring back Andrew Flores to get his take on why he thinks we might be seeing the changes that we noticed from 2016 to 2021, and also if he has any comments on where we might see the youth estimates going. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Jody. I see a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll try and address also. So firstly, I, as opposed to seeing wild differences, right, we are seeing kind of a lot of consistency in what we published in 2016 to what we're looking at today, which is one, beneficial in the sense that, you know, the scientific methods that have been used to conduct the VARFS and the methods that we use to estimate these populations, if we had wildly different numbers, then I think that would actually be a cause for concern. So the consistency here, I think, is actually kind of a benefit. And of course, the age patterns we continue to see as one of the most stark differences across both back in 2016, but then also in 2021. And this also means that I do anticipate that we'll have a large contingent of individuals in the 13 to 17 age range self-identifying as transgender. And many people may ask why in terms of the context. One may be that one potential hypothesis, right? So this is not fully tested, may be that younger individuals are growing up in an environment that might be slightly less stigmatizing to transgender people. Thus, some people may be willing and wanting to self-identify in a context where they, where hypothetically, if they were in a completely different environment, they may not. Two, of course, is that the availability of language and the discussions around gender have definitely changed over time. And what we're seeing in various sources of data is that younger individuals are more likely to take up more diverse sexualities as well as genders than older individuals. And so just the nature of the information environment is definitely different. And that's why there was this question about, do we have any kind of hypothesis about why North Carolina is number one? What interesting thing though, because we did notice that North Carolina was popped out in the data as this ranking number one. This is based on the actual data that's documented in the VRFS. This is not a guess per se based upon a model. This is the actual respondents that took the VRFS in North Carolina. One potential hypothesis there is that because North Carolina had a high level of attention around transgender people and transgender rights with HB2, might have brought greater awareness about transgender people and transgender rights, and also the language of gender and being transgender, and could potentially have created an environment where people were more willing to self-identify in that location than in other locations. However, like I said, it's only a hypothesis that there may be many other potential explanations leading in that result. And then the second question that I'll address before I pass it on to Vivian or pass it back to Jody is the question of whether or not our estimates might be somewhat more conservative or smaller than, say, other sources. One thing that I'll note is that the BRFSS is conducted primarily as a telephone survey with interviews. And so you have to think about how these data get put together to kind of think about how they alter the responses or the results that you may get. And what we do know, at least from prior work, is that telephone interviews, people tend to be pretty honest around, say, self-identifying or disclosing on an anonymous survey, their sexuality and their gender. But there are, say, face-to-face interviews may lower, say, the propensity for someone to self-identify. And we are seeing kind of mode differences in terms of how these data get documented. So if it's a household survey, you may end up with a slightly different result than if it's a telephone survey. Similarly, if it's an online survey, you may get a different result. So that's one reason why our estimates might be slightly different from what other estimates you may be seeing, say, out there that are getting produced. And the second thing I'll note is also the sampling strategy does matter. So these surveys that are conducted by the VRFS are done in a way that's meant to be representative of a population, where a lot of the surveys that you might be seeing get produced may not necessarily be done in a way that may be representative of, say, the US population or adults in the United States. A lot of your online surveys may produce estimates that may deviate, and it may be more related to the sampling strategy. And that's me getting a little bit into the weeds of the nerdiness, but I just wanted to kind of clarify kind of what we're seeing with these data versus what you might be seeing with other data sets. I'm happy to handle any of those additional questions in Q&A, and I'll pass it back to you, Jody.
Thanks, Andrew. And oh, my lighting is a little wild. Nerdiness is always welcome. I think that we always have room for nerdiness in our discussions. We are the Williams Institute after all. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Andrew. And I look forward to more questions in the Q&A if we can address people's questions about why things look the way that they do. I have questions myself, so we're in it together. So now I wanted to turn to the realities of the public policy environment, because each of these estimates represents real people who are living across the United States and are living in a variety of policy environments. So I'm very excited to hand it over to our special guest, Vivian Topping, who is going to talk with us about the evolving public policy landscape for trans folks. Hi, Vivian, take it away.
Hey, Jody. Yeah, glad to be here. One moment, let me share my screen here. Okay. So, hi everyone. I am here for the uplifting moment of talking about the current state of public policy for transgender folks. It is not great at the moment. So before we get into this year, I want to start with just going back to 2020 last year in the legislative session then. There are 3 things that you really need to know and to think about as you kind of think about this year. So first of all, in 2020, we saw our first real big onslaught of anti-trans athlete bans and medical care bans. So bills that would ban transgender youth from participating in sports, and bills that would ban transgender youth from accessing the kind of care that they need in order to address their identities. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, most legislative sessions shut down pretty quickly last year. So many of these bills were not able to advance. However, 3 bills did advance last year and were passed. They're in various states of enforcement right now. There is at least 1 bill that is currently being debated in the courts at the moment still, and so it has not totally been enacted yet. But the 3 bills that went through were first a bill in Tennessee that focused on adoption agencies and allowing adoption agencies and child welfare services to deny service based on religious beliefs. And then in Idaho, they passed 2 anti-transgender bills. The first one was an anti-transgender athlete ban. It was the first one to pass in the country last year and is currently in a legal fight, but it banned transgender youth from being able to participate in sports in the sport that matched and aligned with their gender identity. The other bill that was passed in Idaho was a bill that focused on birth certificates and making it impossible for transgender folks to update birth certificates. Both of those bills, the 2 anti-transgender ones in Idaho, are currently in litigation. But we saw a wave of about 100 bills that were similar to each other, these athlete bans and medical care bans that got introduced in 2020. And we knew that once the pandemic ended, or once the pandemic happened and legislative sessions ended, we would likely need to be ready to fight them again. In addition to the legislative session last year, we also had a landmark ruling from the Supreme Court with Bostock v. Clayton County. So when Bostock v. Clayton County was decided, what that case actually did was said that sexual orientation and gender identity are covered when you say the word sex underneath employment protections because of sex stereotyping. And so because of that, we then across the country were able to argue and say we do have employment protections for LGBTQ people. There's still a long way to go. There's still many things that we need to do, but this is a really huge moment of progress that also we think contributed a little bit to backlash. Whenever we do have a pro-LGBTQ court ruling or a major federal moment, typically in the States, we see significant backlash. If you think back to when marriage equality was legalized by the Supreme Court, we almost immediately in the next legislative session after started seeing legislatures try to pick away and chip away at what marriage equality benefits were available and what actual things they could do. And then lastly is knowing about Virginia. So in 2019, The Virginia legislature went went all blue, and LGBTQ equality is a bipartisan issue. However, we saw significant movement in Virginia once the Democrats took control of the chambers. What we saw there was Virginia becoming the first state in the South to pass non-discrimination protections. They also became one of the first states in the South to pass a conversion therapy ban and a number of other pro-LGBTQ policies. And so we saw that, one, we knew there was going to be a backlash against the Supreme Court ruling. Two, we had already seen some of these anti-transgender bills that had been introduced earlier in the year that only stopped because of the pandemic. And we saw that one of the only ways that we're able to really change, make a significant change on these bills and fight back against them is to change who some of the decision makers are. So this year in 2021, we have seen over 376 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced. When I say anti-LGBTQ, I'm referring to a whole host of different types of bills. So we're talking about the AntiTrans bills that I'm going to focus on today. We're also talking about bills that use religion as a way to discriminate. We're talking about bills that try to bring back bathroom bills that we were dealing with back in 2015 and 2017. And we're seeing all of these different types of bills, including HIV criminalization bills that attack LGBTQ people. The map here, the darker red it is, the more anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced. Texas is currently leading the country. I'd like to point out before we make assumptions about Texas as a state, part of the reason for that is that they are currently on their fourth session of the year, third special session, and each special session, transgender folks have been on the call, and so bills have been introduced. However, Texas has not, at this moment, passed any anti-LGBTQ bills, and the folks on the ground have been able to actually beat back over 70 different bills. But so across the country, we saw this 376. We had some other pretty significant fights in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, in Montana, Idaho, kind of across the country. We really did see a lot of this centered in the South. And so I think those numbers about population showing a couple of Southern states up there in the top 5 really made me feel a bit better about what I'm seeing in the world. We then had about, of those 376, roughly 9%, so 35 of them, were enacted. So they were actually passed through both legislature, through both chambers, and were signed by their state's governor. So within that 376, 184 of them are specifically anti-transgender. This graph is showing the number of anti-transgender bills over the years. As you can see, we kind of peaked in 2016, which is really the main moment of bathroom hysteria, of folks talking about bathrooms and trans people. Those bills then started slowing down, raised a little bit in 2019, and then went from 35 to 100 in 2020, from 100 to now 184 in 2021, and potentially more, depending on how things go the rest of the year. We have 5 times as many since 2019. So in just 2 years, we have 5 times as many anti-transgender bills. And the thing that I'll also note here is that broadly, anti-LGBTQ bills are actually going down. So that 376 is actually a little bit less than we had in 2019 and in 2020. But we have seen these anti-trans bills and these focused bills on transgender folks burst and get higher and continue to dominate much of the conversation. And so as we're thinking about who needs to be centered in this work, as we're thinking about who needs to be centered in this kind of policy work, it's transgender folks. You know, when we think about this, it is trans people, it's transgender folks, the transgender community that needs to be centered, because these attacks are directly coming after us. So if we think about the types of bills that we've seen this year that are anti-LGBTQ, there are really 3 big buckets. There's the medical care bans, the athlete bans, and the religious exemptions. Medical care bans really are multiple different types of bills. So we have seen bills that criminalize doctors for providing care. We've seen bills that criminalize parents for allowing their children to access that care. We have seen bills that reframe gender affirming care as child abuse. And we have seen bills that ban certain types of care. There was a massive bill in Indiana that actually included even counseling, so talk therapy, banning that for transgender youth. There have only been 2 of these medical care bans that have passed across the country this year. So we have seen one pass in Arkansas and one pass in Tennessee. I want to be clear that the one in Tennessee is a little bit different. So the one in Tennessee bans pre-pubertal care. So basically says that no transgender youth can access medical care or medical interventions before puberty. Puberty is when most medical interventions happen. And so while the Tennessee bill, while it has passed, fortunately, may not have as much of an impact as its sponsor may want. In Arkansas, however, the bill does ban care for transgender youth. The interesting thing in Arkansas too is that the governor tried to veto the bill. The governor had heard the voices and stories of transgender youth and said that he did not want to see transgender youth continue to be impacted by this. He did not want to see transgender youth lose access to care. However, the legislature overrode his veto. And now in Arkansas, that bill is also going into a court fight. The thing I'll note about these medical care bans is that even the mere introduction of these bills terrifies families of trans kids and trans people. We've seen internationally that there have been some moments in recent years that have banned care for transgender youth. The most recent notable one was in Tavistock v. Bell in the UK. That decision has now shifted a bit. How initially it was decided was that those under the age of 16 could not consent to any kind of transition-related care and therefore could not access it. It has now been appealed to say that those under 16 in the UK can access care with a parent's permission. And so I think when we see these bills moving in the US and we see this kind of stuff moving quickly, we see what's happening in other countries, and it is a concern that that will happen here. In addition to this, we have the athlete bans. These are the ones that have really kind of taken hold across the country. We have heard about this for years now, but it has really become a focus from our opposition lately. When we had the Equality Act hearing in the House and in the Senate, they talked about athletes and they talked about children or young girls losing opportunity to transgender youth. I want to, before I keep going here, just be really clear that our opposition continues to look for different possibilities of something bad happening because a transgender youth was involved in a sport. And they can only refer back to one incident that happened in Connecticut that has already been resolved. And so when they're talking about these bills, they are looking for a problem to be able to fight. And these are focused primarily as bills that will energize their like a Republican base and a conservative younger base. These athlete bans sometimes are focused on K through 12 schools primarily. Sometimes they will include college sports as well, but it depends on the state. They're primarily targeted at transgender women. And the reason is they focus on levels of testosterone in someone's body and on the potential competitive advantage that our opposition believes that offers. And they oftentimes will leave out trans men, or there will be a line specifically within the bill that says that transgender men can participate where they need to participate. But they really are focused primarily on transgender women and leaning into the same kind of narrative that we've heard in the past about privacy and safety for young girls, and claiming that transgender women are somehow taking those things away. There are varying levels of types of enforcement depending on the state and depending on the bill. These are all really specific to different states because each state also has different athletic associations that have had different policies. For example, some of the earlier bills that were introduced in 2020 were bills that for enforcement required a genital inspection of the youth if the youth was accused of being transgender. Some of them have included something that will focus on genetic testing around transgender youth before, in order to determine their true sex. And they really are like open up transgender youth and any youth to accusations about their gender and about their body that then could potentially be used to perform like physically invasive exams. 8 of these passed in 2021 so far. And in Texas, there is a special session going where one of the focuses of the session is on transgender athlete bans. And there will be a hearing tomorrow in Texas on one of those bills. And then lastly, we had religious exemptions. So there are really 3 categories of these that we've been seeing lately. These are bills generally that create the ability to deny care, deny service based on the provider's religious beliefs or moral beliefs. So the 3 categories that we've been seeing have been broad blanket religious refusal ones. So anyone in any public accommodation denying care or denying access to someone based on their religious beliefs. We've also seen in Arkansas a medical care refusal bill pass. So that allows for medical professionals to deny care based on their religious or moral beliefs. And then we've also seen them happen with adoption and foster care, like what was passed in Tennessee in 2020, allowing adoption agencies and foster care agencies to discriminate based on religious or moral beliefs. We did also see a Supreme Court case about this earlier this year, Fulton v. Philadelphia. However, the Supreme Court ruled very narrowly and did not give a broad statement on how religious exemptions should be taken care of or handled moving forward. So it's still an open question. So by the numbers, just to make sure we kind of come back to this, 376 anti-LGBTQ bills. Of those, 184 of them are anti-trans. Of that 184, 93 of them are athlete bans and 51 of them are medical care bans. The rest are a hodgepodge of bathroom bills and bills that attack document access. And lastly, about 35 of these anti-LGBTQ bills have been enacted. The one thing I will say, that's the end of my actual slides, and I just want to say one more thing before I hand it back to Jody, is that when we think about where these bills are coming from or why this is happening now, it's often the question that I get. This is part of a coordinated attack. And so when we think about this, we're not just talking about coordination about anti-trans attacks. We're talking about coordination among folks who want to delegalize abortion, who want to continue passing voter suppression laws, who want to ban mask mandates, who want to ban vaccine mandates around COVID-19. These are the same folks funding the same things, and they all live within the same kind of strategy. And so I think the information that Jody and Andrew were talking about earlier is incredibly important to remind these folks that transgender people exist. We are here, we are in this country, and we are here and deserve just as much dignity and respect as anybody else. Jody, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Vivian. And thank you so much for walking us through the current policy landscape. There's so much going on that it really helps to kind of see the bird's eye view that you provided, and actually looking at the numbers and looking what's actually happening there in terms of sheer numbers. It's really a lot. And so thank you so much. So we're going to move into Q&A, but I really wanted to take the opportunity to ask you a question first, if you don't mind. There's a lot to be really concerned about, and it's incredibly alarming about what you presented. But I was wondering if you could tell us where you see, either at the state level or federally, some glimmers of hope right now, or either that's happening currently or something that you know, gives you hope for the future. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's funny. That is often the question that is asked after every one of my presentations, and I don't know why people would be looking for optimism after one of my presentations on this, but you know, I think the thing that I look to is really the fact that we've beaten more of these than we've actually lost. So, you know, when we think about the amount of bills that I said passed, we have these 35 bills that have passed this year that are anti-LGBTQ. That means that there's still over 300 bills that we defeated. So like, number one there. The second thing is that in terms of numbers of pro-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced, that number is in roughly the 800s. I don't know off the top of my head, but that number is roughly in the 800s, and also has a far better passage rate than our opposition bills. And so while we may see these massive numbers of anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced, we are seeing a significant number of pro-LGBTQ bills and attempts to codify LGBTQ rights under law. And I think that those are really important. And I think that, while like the thing that makes this work so important right now, and based on the numbers that you're all talking about, is just how much of this work is concentrated in the South and how much of the work that has to happen in the South, because LGBTQ folks live there. I believe the Movement and Advancement Project released a report, I think a year back, on rural LGBTQ folks and showing the kind of lives that rural LGBTQ folks have, largely in the South and the Mountain West. And I think the thing that like brings hope and joy to me is that even in the face of these kinds of anti-LGBTQ bills, these kinds of anti-trans bills, LGBTQ people are consistently rising up, consistently fighting against them, and consistently winning. So the thing that like I think about here, and the thing that I try to remember is that what's happening right now are the attempts of people who are going to be, who are on the losing side, throwing everything that they can at us. I mean, think about it. The fact that like the thing that we are talking about now is about whether or not transgender girls can be in sports. That is apparently for them the last thing that they can get to. They can't figure that out. That's their argument at this point, that they need to talk about girls in sports because somehow we're destroying everything. And so, I think that the thing that gives me hope is the fact that like they're at that level and we are beating them back in every moment.
Thank you for that, Vivian. That it's really helpful to keep that in perspective. That for every defeat, there might be multiple wins. So.
And one like minor thing, not minor, but last thing to say is that we also have a federal administration that is not attacking trans people anymore. We have a federal administration that is actively looking for ways to protect transgender folks. And so like we are in a better spot this year than we were last year, despite how many bills are moving.
Also good to keep that in mind. Sometimes we forget, right? What things have been like in prior years. So staying with you, Vivian, a question came across the Q&A or the chat, asking for clarification on medical care refusals. Are the medical care refusal religious exemptions based on only trans care, or is it broader than that, all medical care, just on the basis that the patient is trans?
Yeah, so it's actually, thank you. I was like, I'm gonna get the mute button before someone wants to tell me. Yes, those are actually two different sets, right? So there are medical care bans and bills that focus specifically on care for transgender youth that ban that specific care. And that can be a whole host of things. They can say that they're banning counseling, that they're banning surgery, that they're banning hormone replacement therapy, all three, all of the above, whatever it may be. And then there are also these religious exemption bills that allow medical professionals to deny care. The medical care bans, those ones about transgender youth, are just for trans kids. The religious ones, though, those impact everybody. And oftentimes they're really focused on abortion and on attacking abortion rights. But the fact is, what it means is that a doctor could say to someone who's of a different religion than them that because that person is of a different religion, they refuse to provide them care. They could say that they do not want to provide, like a pharmacist could refuse to sell or provide Plan B. A pharmacist could refuse a transgender person their hormones, any kind of host of things. So just think about literally any reason that someone could deny you care based on your religious beliefs, they could do that. And that's the state of things in Arkansas right now, and in a few other states.
So staying with you, Vivian, this is kind of interesting. This might be coming up soon, but what research has been done on the topic of trans student athletes and whether they have a competitive advantage over non-trans student athletes? And I'll start by just saying that the Williams Institute is we're certainly looking into this. There's actually not a whole ton of research on this. So we need to, kind of open it up and see where the research needs really are and target the research in the places where the most questions exist. But you might have something to say about that as well.
I do, thank you. So I think first of all, Jody, you're right. There's not a lot of research that's available for folks, right? Like we haven't had like an urgent need to measure whether or not transgender girls can beat cisgender girls in sports. So that has not had a lot of research done, because before now it hasn't really been an issue. But the other thing that I would say too is that in addition to that, when we're talking about trans youth being involved in athletics, we're not talking about trans youth participating in like Olympic level sports. What we're talking about is like participating in the school basketball team. Like that's what we're not talking about, this Olympic level world. That's a whole different land. So like, first of all, keep that in mind. And second of all, when we are talking about those Olympic level athletes, most athletes have some kind of internal biological competitive advantage of their own. I think the example that I always hear is Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps as a swimmer did not just become a good swimmer because he worked hard. Yes, he worked hard, but also he has a body that is like really good for swimming. He has a larger body. He's able to do those things. So the way his body is really actually set up for him to be better and stronger at those kinds of things. And so I would really say that when we think about competitive advantage, for me, there isn't anything conclusive that says like yes or no. And I would also say that when we think about it, like testosterone levels, which are the things that people are trying to use as a reason for excluding transgender girls, do not predict athletic performance. Various studies of testosterone levels among athletes fail to show a consistent relationship with performance. And while some studies do show some kind of correlation between testosterone and explosive power, others have found a negative connotation between testosterone and performance. And so there are a lot of questions still to be answered here. And when we're thinking about these bills, the fact that 8 of them have passed without real science behind them tells me this is not about competitive advantage. This is not about protecting girls' sports. This is about discriminating against transgender girls and transgender kids.
Stick with you, Vivian. I'm gonna like kind of combine these last two, and then I'm gonna go back to Andrew because there's some additional questions for Andrew as well. But while trying not to I guess kind of make a blanket conclusion about Republican level of support for these types of bills, that there might be some variance there. Why do you think we're not seeing the level of support that we had in 2016 and 2017 from the bigger LGB and business communities to help us today? Maybe the analogy is maybe an HB2, it was like a little bit more of a rock fight. We're not quite seeing that yet. And then also finally, how do you see the legal challenges progressing in regards to some of the bills?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I also did see that question when you were talking, and I was like, oh yeah, I need to talk for Republicans. Just to be really clear, like this is not a partisan issue. We have had difficulties with folks on both sides of the aisle about anti-trans bills, particularly on medical care and athlete bans. And we have also had Republicans that have supported us. The veto in Arkansas was a Republican governor. The only Republican veto that has stuck that did not have a legislative override was in North Dakota, and with a North Dakota Republican governor. And so like, we really shouldn't say that like, this is all Republican or all Democrat. That's not the case. What I would say, and what I think is part of the reason that we are seeing so much more Republican engagement around this, is that based on the polling, some Republicans have decided that this is the wedge issue that they want to focus on for elections. And they said that openly. This is not a conspiracy theory. They have openly said, we are doing this so that we can boost our turnout and win elections in 2022. The fact is, we also know that the vast majority of people are against these bills on both sides of the aisle. And so like, this is not a thing that they really want, that really is like a broad piece, this is a concern of a very small portion of people that some consultants have decided are important to mobilize for Republicans. And so they are focusing hard there. And what was the second part of the question, Jody? I'm sorry.
It was about how are the legal challenges progressing?
Yeah. So I am not as tuned in with some of the legal work. I focus primarily on state legislative work. And so I can't really answer. What I would say is that I know there are lawsuits in Arkansas, West Virginia, and Idaho, and all of them are in varying states at the moment. What we do know is that our opposition wants to bring this to the Supreme Court. They want this there. And so you should expect to see continued legal work happening around this, and you should expect to probably see something like this at the Supreme Court at some point over the next few years.
So this one comes from John Davidson. Hi, John. And it can be for both Vivian and Andrew because it's about public opinion. So PRI data shows that there's a majority opposition to trans girls and cis women participating in sports that are designated for women. What suggestions do you have for turning public opinion around?
I'll jump in just quickly, and then I would, of course, would love to hear Vivian's thoughts as well. As you noted, Jody, about kind of what might be like certain brighter pieces of the policy environment and the narrative. Well, one thing that on the public opinion front is that people in general don't really think or have about LGBTQ rights. And so when they hear about these new policy issues, they tend to kind of jump to conclusions based upon kind of an initial gut reaction. But what these longer involved discussions have across numerous states and across numerous environments continues to raise the discussion about say trans women and athletes, right? And it's that increased intention, it's that increased opportunity for like discussion about those policy issues that might actually change people's minds. And so I always say, by focusing in on these issues or these topics, actually engage with people to make them even more persuadable than what they might have otherwise. So I have some experimental work that I've been doing, and we are seeing like different responses to different pieces of information. So if we talk about various forms of competitive advantage, some people may respond differently than others. However, this is a very fluid time, say, in public opinion, and such that you give people a piece of information, they can rely on that information to be more affirming, but they can also rely on some of that information to be less affirming, say, of trans women in sports. And so there's plenty to go around in terms of who should be telling certain stories, what stories should be told, and how do you reach people to, say, talk about these topics. Vivian, I don't know if you have more to say.
Yeah, I think I want to second everything Andrew just said, first of all. I also want to make it really clear that there is no evidence to support that transgender athletes are impacting girls' sports policy. What we actually have seen is the opposite. The Center for American Progress had a report that when a state has a policy that includes transgender athletes, participation for cisgender women and girls is actually stronger. And so I think that what this is folks really looking for an area to attack, an area to find a fight. They know that folks may not understand what it means for a kid to transition. We as a movement have not talked about that because frankly, the inner workings of my body and my medical care are no one else's business but mine and my doctor's. And the same for a transgender youth. It is for the transgender youth and their doctor and their provider to actually figure out what makes sense and what is the right thing. No one when we talk about transitioning is generally done under the care of a doctor. And those are the folks who actually can have an opinion on this, right? But when we're thinking about this right now, because folks don't have a picture in their head about what it means to be transgender sometimes, because they specifically don't have an understanding of what it means to be a transgender kid, these kinds of bills and these kinds of attacks rely on that ignorance or that misunderstanding to then make it even worse. And I would say that like when we think about this relates deeply into the misinformation work that we're seeing across the country right now. You know, when we see the kind of misinformation that's moving online, this is one of the things that folks focus on. When Breitbart or the Daily Caller post an article about transgender athletes, that is usually one of their articles with the highest engagement that they see online. And so we know that like this is, when we're thinking about trying to move people on this, I think that like this research and the study and the work that you all are talking about has really created a good foundation. The other piece is needing to share stories about what it means to be transgender and needing to talk about what our lives are like and where this is at, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to move folks.
Thank you, both Andrew and Vivian, for taking on that topic. Changing hearts and minds, I think, is always one of the toughest things that we contemplate. So we are out of time, unfortunately. We do have more questions. Some of the questions came up as like, how do we centralize people with disabilities and people of color, specifically African-American, Indigenous, Asian Pacific Islanders within the LGBTQIA community? This question comes up a lot, is like, how do we measure people who don't identify themselves on surveys? Essentially, isn't the percentage really much higher than what we're actually seeing? And as far as I know, we don't have a great way of measuring things that aren't measured, unfortunately. And then again, why we are seeing the states, the state rankings change so dramatically. We have maybe 1 minute left if either of you wants to talk about that. Otherwise, we're gonna have to wrap up. Do either of you want to add a final thought on any of those topics?
I actually do, and I want to just give a short plug for it. So when we think about like that number, when you're talking about needing to be able to get an accurate count of how many folks are actually there. The US Trans Survey that was done in 2015 and that is being redone next year is going to be one of the best places to get that information, because a huge piece of whether or not we are honest with a survey comes from like if we trust the messenger and if we trust that person, and knowing that, and trans folks knowing that a trans-led organization is moving that survey will encourage us to be more honest when we actually fill that out. And so I think that for me, it's make sure that if you're trans, that you fill out the US Trans Survey next year, and that if you are not trans, that you are posting about it and sharing it and connecting people with it.
Shout out to the US Trans Survey. I can second that. Andrew, any final thoughts?
I don't want to beleaguer the numbers too much, but I will say that each state does have demographic compositional differences. Some states tend to have more older individuals than say younger individuals, and so when you think about rankings changing or the numbers potentially changing, we got to think that while populations do stay kind of constant, there is definitely population change and unevenness. And so you can think of some states as being more racially, ethnically diverse. And we do know that when it comes to the survey data, that people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color tend to be more likely to self-identify as transgender, say, than individuals who are non-Hispanic white. So that's part of the explanation there. But Jody, you might want to leave us on a better note than nerdy data stuff.
Nerdy data stuff. Well, I don't know what's better than nerdy data stuff personally, but there are ways to look at this, hopefully, and I thank Vivian for sharing those with us. And thank you, Andrew, for sharing your expertise with us very much. If we did not get to your question, you can certainly email us. Our contact information is available on our website. And thank you very much to everybody who came today. And it was fantastic to be with you all.
Thank you for having us, Jody.
Thank you so much.